Nobody inside the paddock wanted to frame it this way. Not at first, because once the conversation moved away from passion, reputation, and highlight reels, and toward cold numbers, braking traces, and exit speed graphs, the story stopped being comfortable. For years, one narrative dominated modern superbike racing. Toprak Razgatlıoğlu was the last of a dying breed, a rider who could outbrake anyone, anywhere, on anything. A rider who seemed to defy physics, leaning deeper, braking later, lifting the rear wheel like it was a signature rather than a risk. And across the pit lane stood Ducati. Efficient, ruthless, data-driven, a machine designed not to impress but to win. The debate was inevitable. But when the data finally came together, the truth wasn't what either side expected. And once it surfaced, there was no way to ignore it anymore. What made Toprak different was never subtle. From the moment he arrived at the highest level, engineers noticed something unsettling. His braking zones didn't just start later, they were shorter, more violent, and far more unstable than the models predicted. Where most riders eased pressure to protect the front, Toprak piled it on. Where others avoided rear lift, he flirted with it. To spectators, it looked spectacular. To rivals, it looked impossible. To data engineers, it looked dangerous. His Yamaha often entered corners with the rear wheel hovering, the chassis loaded in ways that made telemetry charts spike in places they weren't supposed to. Yet somehow he made it work, again and again. This wasn't reckless riding, it was feel. A rare, almost intuitive understanding of grip at the very edge. But that edge came with consequences few outside the garage fully understood. Because while braking brilliance can win moments, races are won across entire laps, and Ducati had built its philosophy around that truth. Ducati never tried to beat Toprak at his own game. They didn't chase the latest breaking point. They didn't encourage riders to overload the front. Instead, they designed stability into everything from the aero package to the electronics to how torque was delivered when the bike stood up. On paper, Ducati riders often braked earlier. But that was never the weakness critics claimed it to be. The Desmos Decide-derived V4 carried speed differently. Braking zones were calmer, pressure curves smoother, entry speed slightly compromised by choice, because what came next was devastating. Corner exit. While Toprak was still wrestling the bike back into balance after an extreme stop, Ducati riders were already transferring load, picking up the throttle, and letting the machine do what it did best, launch. This wasn't riding style. It was philosophy. And for a long time, the two worlds coexisted without confrontation. Until the data started getting compared. When engineers finally overlaid braking traces, the first reaction wasn't excitement. It was confusion. Yes, Toprak braked later, that part was real. His maximum brake pressure often exceeded Ducati riders by a clear margin. His deceleration peaks were sharper, his stopping distances shorter. But the time gained wasn't as dramatic as people expected. In some corners, the advantage was only a few hundredths. In others, it vanished entirely by mid-corner. Ducati's earlier braking was offset by stability, allowing riders to carry consistent speed without micro-corrections. The shock came when full lap simulations were run. Toprak's gains under braking didn't translate into dominant lap time superiority. They were being neutralized, sometimes completely, by what happened after the apex. And that's when attention shifted to the part no highlight reel ever shows. What braking takes away? Extreme braking loads the tire differently. Every late stop, every rear lift, every violent transfer of weight creates heat, stress, and degradation that doesn't show up immediately. Over a single lap, it's manageable. Over race distance, it compounds. Data from longer runs revealed a quiet pattern. Toprak's braking zones were brilliant early, but as laps accumulated, the front tire began to lose consistency. Small slides increased, micro-adjustments crept in, entry confidence faded not visibly but measurably. Ducati's approach aged better. Smoother braking preserved grip, stable exits reduced wheel spin, tire temperature curves stayed flatter. And while they rarely produced moments of spectacle, they produced something far more valuable. Predictability. Races weren't won in the braking zone. They were won in the last 5 laps. And suddenly, a painful realization began circulating behind closed garage doors. Talent wasn't the issue. Trade-offs were. This realization didn't stay confined to World SBK. Because once the data existed, other people started asking questions. Quiet ones, unofficial ones. Could this braking style work with carbon brakes? Would it translate to prototypes with less forgiving front-end feedback? How would it hold up over a full MotoGP race distance? According to insiders, admiration and concern existed side by side. Everyone respected Toprak's ability. No one doubted his courage or control. But the same engineers who marveled at his braking wondered whether it demanded too much adaptation from the machine and from the rider himself. Ducati's philosophy suddenly looked less boring and more inevitable. Not because it was safer, but because it was scalable. And that's when the debate stopped being about lap time and started being about futures. As expected, fans turned data into ammunition. Some saw proof that Toprak's magic was overrated. Others argued the numbers missed the human element entirely. Social media fractured into camps, each convinced the truth was obvious. Inside the paddock, the tone was different. No one dismissed Toprak. No one claimed Ducati had solved riding. Instead, subtle comments surfaced, phrases like context matters and different strengths for different eras. Because the truth was uncomfortable for everyone. Toprak wasn't being exposed. But he wasn't disproving physics either. And Ducati wasn't unbeatable. They were just optimized for modern racing reality. Then one final realization emerged, the kind that reframes everything. Data never lies. But it never tells the whole story. It doesn't measure courage when the rear wheel lifts at 300 kilometers per hour. It doesn't capture instinct when grip disappears without warning. And it doesn't explain why certain riders make impossible things look routine. What the data actually proved was simpler and far more interesting. Toprak's braking is extraordinary. Ducati's efficiency is relentless. One wins moments. The other wins margins. And in modern racing, margins decide championships. The paddock didn't crown a winner in this debate. They adjusted their understanding. Because greatness was never about braking later than everyone else. It was about knowing when not to. And that, more than any number on a graph, changed how the story was told.